Do you ever get confused when people use pro wrestling language like Kayfabe and heat? Are you concerned you might be a queen or a Strawb? Does this Hulk Hogan tweet melt your brain? Good night, Hulkamaniacs and jabroni marks without a life that don't know how to work when you work and work yourself into a shoot marks? Then you need to learn how to speak wrestling with me, Ollie Davis. Professional wrestling began in the carnivals of the late 19th century, when legitimate contests evolved into scripted exhibitions designed to entertain crowds and, sometimes, con them out of their money. To protect the secrets of the trade from anyone eavesdropping, wrestlers and promoters developed their own coded language, likely adapted from the carnival's carny speak or pig Latin used to fool their customers, and Cockney rhyming slang, which was used by criminals to confuse the police. Arguably, the most important and secretive of these words is kayfabe. Back in the day, the word kayfabe was a warning. Someone would yell it to let everyone know an outsider was nearby, like if a venue employee, a fan, or even a wrestler's family member was about to enter the locker room. So the wrestlers would go back into character and that the fictional good and bad guys shouldn't be seen socializing together. The phrase is still used today, even though the vast majority of fans are now in on wrestling's secret. A media interview might be described as being done in kayfabe if the wrestler stays in character. But where does the word kayfabe come from? The most popular theory is that it's from a kind of pig Latin that carnival workers would use to speak in code to each other if members of the public were nearby. Pig Latin, for those of you who don't know, involves moving the first consonant of a word to the end and then adding the letters AY to further disguise it. For example, the words pig Latin would become igpay atinlay, or oye ume is your mum. So how does that help us with the word kayfabe? Some have suggested it might be a muddled version of be fake, with it being split into the syllables be, fa, and ka, and then rearranged to kayfabe. Others, though, believe it comes from the old British wartime phrase keep cavey, which means to look out for or beware. There are two wilder theories behind the phrase, though. One is that it's named after a mute wrestler called Kayfabian, which sounds like your first ever creator wrestler, and that his name became a shorthand for keeping quiet. The other is from MMA fighter Chael Sonnen, who has suggested it was a way for carnival employees to let their families know they had safely made it to the next town, without having to spend money on a payphone. They would call collect, tell the operator their name was Kayfabe, and then their families would refuse the call, knowing that their loved one was safe because they had used the code name, without needing to pay to talk to them. To add even more confusion, kayfabe isn't the only word for kayfabe. Some wrestlers in the UK will still use this expression: watch out, there's a bunch of queens coming. Don't worry, this isn't a homophobic slur. In Cockney rhyming slang, Queens is short for Queen's Park Rangers, which is a football team based in London. Rangers rhymes with strangers, so by saying Queens, a wrestler is secretly warning others of a stranger nearby. The term mark is used in wrestling to describe fans who believe or behave as though they believe that the matches and storylines are legitimate. It's often used in a derogatory way, mocking the fans because it makes them spend more money. That's because the term, again, has its roots in the world of carnivals and con games, where a mark means the potential victim of a scam. In the carnival context, it was someone who was seen as an easy target, who could be tricked into spending money on rigged games. It comes from the early 19th century, when the carnival workers would literally mark the unsuspecting mark with chalk to let others know they could be easily tricked in the games. But to make things more confusing, again, even a wrestler can be a mark. If a wrestler starts to take fictional parts of the business too seriously, like someone who is more interested in holding a championship rather than making more money, they could be described as a mark for him or herself. In the 90s and noughties, as the business broke kayfabe more and more, the term smart fans was created as an opposite to marks. They were outsiders who were smart to the business, knowing, or thinking they knew, how wrestling worked behind the scenes. And from that came another term, the Smark, a portmanteau of smart and mark, to describe someone who knows everything is predetermined, but chooses to believe and spend all their money anyway. And why don't you come and be a Smark with us by super kicking that subscribe button? We've got daily wrestling news and reviews covering WWE and AEW, podcasts, game shows and more. And if you want even more fun, support us at patreon.com/WrestleTalk while we dive way too deep into the biggest wrestling stories of all time. We did the breakup of The Shield, and it's about 25 hours long. That's patreon.com/WrestleTalk, and subscribe and enable notifications to always on. Babyface and heel are two of the most well-known terms in wrestling speak. They describe the classic hero, a babyface, versus the villain, heel dynamic of a pro wrestling match, and they come from broadly used terms in American slang in the late 19th century. Back then, the word babyface was used to describe someone with youthful, innocent, or non-threatening facial features, while the word heel described an untrustworthy or morally corrupt person. The latter appears to have come from the criminal underworld and vaudeville culture, where calling someone a heel meant they lacked integrity. But babyface and heel aren't universally used in wrestling. In the UK's World of Sport era, good guy wrestlers were mostly called blue eyes, which was from British slang where a blue-eyed boy or blue-eyed girl was someone who was seen in a positive light. Meanwhile, in Mexico, still to this day, the good guys are called technicos, from the Spanish word for technician or technical, which reflects the character's style in the ring. They use their skill to win, they don't cheat. The bad guys, however, are rudos, from the Spanish word meaning rough, rude, or unpolished. They mirror this by having a more aggressive, cheating in-ring style. Speaking of cheating in-ring styles, how about the Montreal Screwjob? It only took me 3 words to bring up the Montreal Screwjob. Stop me if you've heard this one before. The Montreal Screwjob was when Vince McMahon legitimately screwed Bret Hart at Survivor Series 1997, where they agreed on one finish, but Vince instructed referee Earl Hebner to call Bret tapping out when he wasn't. A la not kayfabe. You catching on? Before all that though, Bret and Vince had agreed that the finish of the match would be a schmozz. The word can be traced back to Yiddish and American slang, specifically the word schmooze, which originally meant to chat or to converse. Over time, the pronunciation and meaning evolved to mean a sense of confusion or disarray, particularly when conversations or situations became chaotic. Wrestling took this word and used it to describe the confusion and chaos in a match finish that just breaks down into a brawl or interference. It's a technique generally used to protect wrestlers from having to get actually pinned in the ring by having others brawl around them. Some terms that are originally used sincerely might become offensive over time if they're describing something that is thought less of. The jobber is one of those, as these days they're often referred to as the politer but much clunkier sounding enhancement talent. But the concept of the jobber is almost as old as the wrestling industry itself. It originates from the slang use of the word job, which was common in various trades and entertainment industries like the theatre and vaudeville during the early 20th century, and was simply used to mean a task or assignment, specifically an unglamorous one done solely for the money. A jobber, therefore, would be someone whose role it is to get beaten up and lose by the bigger wrestling stars. The jobber's natural habitat is the squash match, where the enhancement talent would be beaten up quickly to make their opponent look as strong as possible, which comes from the English verb to squash, meaning to crush or flatten something with force. To quote wrestling philosopher Hulk Hogan again, "Good night, Hulkamaniacs and jabroni marks without a lift that don't know it'll work when you work a work and work yourself into a shoot, marks." In wrestling, a work means a scripted performance, and the shoot is something legitimate. The origins of work aren't that surprising. Putting on a show is literally what the wrestlers do when they're at work. Wrestlers also use the term in other contexts, like working the crowd, which is when they're trying to get a particular response from the audience, similar to how someone might say they are working a particular muscle when they're in the gym. Shoot, however, is far more interesting. A straight shooter is common slang for a person who speaks honestly and directly, but it actually has its roots, once again, in wrestling's birthplace of the carnival. A A straight shooter was a gun in a carnival game that hadn't been gimmicked to fire at an angle, thus causing the mark to miss their target. The carnival worker operating the shooting gallery game would use a straight shooter to show how easy it is to win, to then trick the mark by swapping out the gun for one with a dodgy aim. If a wrestler begins to shoot on their opponent in a match, it means they are intentionally going off script and beating them up. And a shoot interview would mean someone is going to drop kayfabe and give their honest thoughts and stories about the industry. As usual, there's a third muddled category between a shoot and a work: the worked shoot, which is when the wrestlers agree to do things legitimately to make their performance seem more authentic. This can be seen in the shoot wrestling style made popular in Japan in the 1970s, which was based on legitimate catch-as-catch-can amateur wrestling, with the likes of Lou Thesz, Billy Robinson and Karl Gotch using grappling and submission holds. This shoot wrestling is, confusingly, really a work, in that both wrestlers are working together, and it's not just in the ring. CM Punk's famous 2011 pipe bomb promo is considered a worked shoot, because although it felt like he was going off script, WWE had told him to go out there for that very purpose. There is probably no other word in pro wrestling that has as many meanings as heat. Obviously, the word itself means warmth, but it can also colloquially be used to mean high intensity, like a heated argument or a hot crowd in a music gig. In broadcast transmission, if the audio is too loud, it will be described as coming in too hot. It has similar meanings in wrestling. Heat, as in booing from a crowd, refers to heated emotions from the fans. The same is true of heat between wrestlers backstage, which is used to describe genuine tension. The most specific usage to wrestling, however, is the heat as part of a wrestling match, which specifically describes when the heel beats down the babyface. Not only does this whip up heat from the crowd, it also describes the theatrical pressure on the hero to make their comeback. The good comparison from other everyday language being, the heat is on. So if a heel is bringing the heat to an opponent, they are increasingly beating them down, putting more and more pressure on them to give up. Part of the heroics of a babyface comes from their ability to withstand this heat before making their unlikely comeback and turning the tables on their opponent. To help with this next one, as it's quite obscure, in a sentence you might say, "He is red reels," or "That match was red reels." It's a phrase mostly used in British wrestling, and is actually one I'd never heard of before we started researching this video, and, as usual, it has its roots in Cockney rhyming slang. If a person or a match is described as being red reels, it actually means rotten. How, you might ask? Well, it's simple, because red reels refers to reels of cotton, and cotton rhymes with rotten. Can't believe you didn't get that right away. Interestingly, red reels isn't just a piece of wrestling slang, it's a full-on physical gesture. When you call someone red reels, you might also put your thumbs under your armpits and bring your elbows down to your sides at the same time, kind of like an overextended Fonz. This probably has its roots in theatre, where a very similar pose was traditionally made in pantomimes to signify disapproval. In wrestling, it helps the performers non-verbally communicate to those watching backstage that they think their match, storyline, or opponent is bad. If someone is red reels, they might also be a strawb, which is a word used to describe a performer who isn't good enough to be working in the business. The word is believed to be short for strawberry mivvy, a traditional British dessert, and mivvy rhymes with civvy, meaning a civilian, or someone who isn't or shouldn't be inside the business. So calling someone a strawb is a way of saying they have no place being in the ring and should be on the other side of the barrier. And it can also be used to describe fans in the same kind of derogatory way as the term mark. You can get loads more bonus wrestling videos over at patreon.com/WrestleTalk. And want more behind the scenes wrestling stories? Go watch the eternal rivalry of Triple H and The Rock by clicking the video on screen now.